I was 94 years old the day I found out my whole life had been a lie somebody else told for me. It came in an envelope so old the glue had turned brown. My name was on the front, my maiden name, a name I hadn't used since 1953. The postmark said it was mailed from an army base in Germany. The date on that postmark said November 1953. 70 years. That letter sat in a dead mail bin, then a warehouse, then a box nobody opened for 70 years. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not an angry woman by nature. I raised 4 kids. I buried a husband I loved in my own quiet way. I have made my peace with a lot of things in 94 years on this earth. But when I opened that envelope and I read the first line, my hands started shaking so bad my granddaughter had to take it from me and read the rest out loud. Because the man who wrote that letter, the man the whole family always said abandoned me, never abandoned me at all. Somebody stole him from me. And I'm about to tell you exactly who, exactly how, and exactly what I did about it once I found out, at 94 years old, with nothing left to lose and 70 years of quiet finally running out. I sat in my granddaughter's living room that afternoon, tea going cold on the coffee table, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Not sadness, not even shock, not really, not after the first minute. What I felt was rage, the clean, focused kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself with shouting, the kind that just sits quietly in your chest and starts making plans. Stay with me, because this gets so much worse before it gets better. Hi, I'm Eleanor. Most people call me Ellie. If this is your first time here, welcome. I promise you, you have never heard a story quite like this one. This is a true story about a love letter that took 70 years to reach me, a betrayal that lasted an entire lifetime, and a plan I put together at 94 years old to make sure the truth didn't die with me. Before I keep going, if you want more stories like this, real stories about people who got betrayed by the ones closest to them and found a way to get their truth back, hit subscribe now, because you are not going to want to miss where this story goes. I told you this gets worse. I meant it. What I found out after that first letter is going to make you scream at your screen, so buckle up. Let's start at the beginning, back when I was 21 years old and I thought I knew exactly how my life was going to go. A quick note before we dive in. I recorded this whole account myself, in my own words, with my granddaughter's help getting it down clearly, because I wanted it told right, from the person who actually lived it. Every letter I describe, every conversation comes from what I remember, what Claire and I found in writing, and what family members confirmed to us directly. This isn't a story somebody made up to get views. This is 70 years of my actual life finally getting said out loud. In the fall of 1951, I was 21 years old, living in a small town in Ohio, working at my father's hardware store behind the counter, and I had never once in my life felt the way I felt the day Tommy Callahan walked through that door.
Tommy was 23. He'd just come back from basic training, home on leave before his unit shipped out. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He wasn't the kind who made a big show of things. He just had this way of looking at you like you were the only person worth looking at. He came in to buy a hinge for his mother's screen door. He left 45 minutes later having bought nothing because we just stood there talking until my father cleared his throat from the back room. I fell for him slow, and then all at once. That's the only way I know how to describe it. One week he was just a nice boy who kept finding excuses to come by the store. The next week, I was lying awake at night rearranging my whole future around him. We had 6 months together before his unit shipped out for Germany. 6 months of Sunday drives, of him teaching me to dance in my parents' kitchen because I never learned, of him promising me, swearing to me that the second his service was up, he was coming home to marry me. I believed him with everything I had. Now here's where I have to tell you about my sister, Margaret, 2 years older than me, sharp as a tack, and I didn't see this back then, I want to be honest with you, the kind of person who could not stand watching someone else get something she wanted for herself. Margaret had been sweet on Tommy since we were teenagers. Everybody knew it. It was one of those things families joke about. Oh, Maggie's had a crush on that Callahan boy since she was 14. Nobody thought much of it, including me. Looking back now, and this is the part that keeps me up some nights, there were signs, little ones. The way Margaret would linger a beat too long whenever Tommy came around. The way she volunteered, out of nowhere, to be the one who walked to the post office for the family every single day, rain or shine, right around the time Tommy started writing to me from his training base. At 21, I thought that was just Margaret being helpful. I want you to remember that detail. Write it down if you have to, because it matters more than almost anything else in this whole story. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular, maybe a month before Tommy shipped out. My father, who liked to tease, looked across the table at Margaret and said, "Maggie, didn't you have your eye on that Callahan boy first?" And Margaret laughed it off, easy as anything, said, "Oh, that was years ago, Daddy. I've grown up since then." Everyone laughed along with her. I laughed too. Nobody at that table noticed how her eyes flicked over to me for just a second before she laughed. I didn't notice it either, not then. It took me 70 years and a stranger's handwriting to understand what that look actually meant. My best friend at the time, a girl named Dorothy who worked at the diner 2 doors down from my father's store, said something to me once that I brushed off completely. We were doing each other's hair one Saturday, and out of nowhere she said, "You know your sister still asks about Tommy Callahan every time I see her at the exchange." I remember laughing and saying, "Well, everybody asks about everybody in this town, Dot. That's just how it is." Dorothy didn't laugh back. She just kept braiding my hair, quiet, like she wanted to say more and thought better of it. I think about that moment more than almost any other memory from those years. Dorothy saw something. She just didn't have the words for it, any more than I did. There was a boy named Frank Doyle who courted Margaret seriously for about a year right around that same time. A perfectly nice young man who worked at the feed store and clearly adored her. Margaret broke it off with him rather suddenly that same summer, right around when Tommy started coming around the hardware store more often. My mother fretted over it for weeks, worried Margaret had made a terrible mistake letting a good, steady man go. Margaret just told her, breezily, "Frank was fine, Mother, but fine isn't forever." I didn't think much of the timing back then. I think about it constantly now. A few weeks before Tommy left, Margaret came to me on her own, sat right down on the edge of my bed, and said, "Ellie, let me be the one who mails your letters to Tommy. I walk right past the post office every morning on my way to the exchange. It's silly for you to go out of your way after a full shift at the store." I thought it was the kindest thing in the world. I remember hugging her and telling her she was the best sister a girl could ask for. I want you to sit with that. I hugged her. I thanked her. I told her she was the best sister a girl could ask for, and she smiled at me and said, "That's what sisters are for," while she was already planning, I have to believe now, exactly how she'd use that trust against me. The morning Tommy's bus left for the train depot 2 towns over, half the family came down to see him off, Margaret included. I remember she stood a little apart from the rest of us, arms crossed against the cold, watching Tommy hold my face in both his hands and promise me the world. I thought, at the time, she looked wistful, maybe a little embarrassed to witness something so private. Looking back at the photograph my mother took that morning, I still have it. Margaret isn't looking at Tommy and me at all. She's looking straight at the camera, and there's something in her expression I never had a name for until 3 months ago. It isn't wistfulness, it's calculation. The night before Tommy shipped out, he took my hands in the back lot behind the hardware store, and he told me, "Ellie, I'm going to write you every single week. I don't care where they send me. You're going to hear from me every week, and the day I'm back on American soil, I'm putting a ring on your finger." I remember I laughed at him that night, half crying already, and said, "You're going to write me poetry from a barracks, Tommy Callahan?" And he got very serious, the way he only did a few times in all the months I knew him, and said, "I mean it, Ellie. You're the only thing about home I'm going to think about over there. I need you to believe that, whatever happens, however long it takes." I told him I believed him. God help me, I did believe him, completely, with the kind of faith you only have once in your life before the world has had the chance to teach you better. I told him I'd write back just as often. I meant it. I meant every word. I met his mother that spring, a stern but kind woman named Ruth, who ran her household with the precision of a drill sergeant and still somehow made the best pot roast I've ever had in my life. She looked me over hard the first time Tommy brought me by, and then she said, "Well, you've got good hands. That's a start." I didn't understand what she meant until years later, when I realized she meant I looked like a woman who worked, who wasn't afraid of a hard life. Ruth Callahan liked me. She told Tommy so more than once, according to him, which mattered more to a boy like Tommy than almost anything else in the world.
We had a whole little routine by that summer. Sunday drives out past the county line in his father's borrowed truck, the windows down, me trying to keep my hair from turning into a bird's nest, and mostly failing. He'd stop at this one bend in the river where the light came through the trees just right in the late afternoon, and we'd sit on the tailgate and talk about nothing and everything, what our kids' names would be, whether we'd stay in Ohio or try our luck somewhere bigger, whether I'd let him teach me to fish, even though I told him plainly I thought fishing was the most boring activity ever invented by man. He gave me a small silver locket that night, nothing fancy, the kind you could find in any 5 and dime, but he'd had my initials scratched into the back of it by a jeweler 2 towns over, and he told me to keep it close until he could put something better on my finger. I wore that locket every day for the next 1.5 years. I still have it. It's in a drawer in my nightstand right now, and some nights, even at 94, I still open that drawer and hold it. For the first 2 months, it was everything he promised. Letters came like clockwork. I wrote back the same day, every time, and gave my letters straight to Margaret to drop at the post office on her way to her job at the telephone exchange, since it was right on her route and I was working the counter till closing most days. I handed my heart to my own sister to carry down the street. I didn't think twice about it. Then, right around month 3, his letters started coming less often, shorter, colder almost. Where he used to write me 2-3 pages about missing me and counting days, I started getting half a page about the weather in Germany and how tired he was from drills. I told myself it was the army. I told myself men get busy, get worn down, get homesick and quiet. I told my girlfriends at the time that I wasn't worried. I was lying to myself, and I didn't even know it. I remember asking Margaret right around that time if she thought something was wrong. We were folding laundry in the kitchen, and I said, "Maggie, do you think Tommy's letters have gotten strange?" And she didn't even look up from the towel she was folding. She said, "Men get like that overseas, Ellie. Don't read too much into it. You'll drive yourself crazy." I took that advice. I stopped reading too much into it. I stopped trusting my own instincts, actually, because my own sister, the person I trusted most in the world besides Tommy himself, kept telling me gently, patiently that I was imagining things. That's its own kind of theft, I've come to understand. She didn't just steal his letters, she stole my ability to trust what I already knew in my gut.
By that autumn, I'd started having a recurring dream, the same one, almost every week, where I was standing at the train station waiting for him, and every train came through empty. I never told anyone about that dream except Dorothy. She just squeezed my hand and said, "That's just nerves, honey. He's coming home." I believed her. I believed everybody except the small, quiet part of myself that already knew something was wrong. There was one more moment from that autumn I didn't think much of until this whole thing unraveled. My mother, worried about how thin and pale I'd gotten worrying over Tommy's cooling letters, suggested I write to his mother, Ruth, directly, just to check in and keep the connection warm even if Tommy himself had gone quiet. I mentioned the idea to Margaret at supper one night, thinking she'd think it was sensible. Instead, she talked me out of it almost immediately, saying it would look desperate and unbecoming for a girl to go around her own fiancé writing to his mother like that. I dropped the idea. I have wondered since whether that single conversation with Ruth might have unraveled the whole scheme 18 months early, and Margaret somehow sensed exactly that. But what happened next, I never saw coming. By month 6, the letters stopped almost entirely. When they came, they read like they'd been written by a stranger wearing Tommy's handwriting. No "I love you," no counting the days, just short, distant little notes. And then, 3 days before Christmas 1952, one final letter arrived. It said he'd met someone else, a nurse stationed near his base, and that it wasn't fair to keep stringing me along. It said he was sorry. It said he hoped I'd understand. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table with that letter in my hands, and I could not breathe. I could not make my lungs work right. My mother thought I was having some kind of fit. My father just sat there, quiet, the way men of that generation did when they didn't know what to say to a heartbroken daughter. Margaret sat across the table from me that night, and I remember this so clearly now, though God help me I didn't understand it at the time. She reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "Some men just aren't worth the wait, Ellie. You'll find somebody better." I cried for 3 straight days after that letter came. I couldn't eat. I lost so much weight that spring, my mother took me to see Dr. Hollis, the family physician, worried I'd come down with something serious. He just told my mother quietly in the hallway that some things take time to heal, and there wasn't a pill for a broken heart. Margaret sat with me almost every one of those nights, brushing my hair, telling me everything would be all right. I clung to her. She was, as far as I knew, the one steady thing in my whole collapsing world. I want you to really sit with that detail, because it's the part that still makes my stomach turn the most, even now. The woman comforting me every night while I cried over a lie was the same woman who wrote that lie herself in a hand she'd practiced copying from mine. She held me while I grieved a man who never left me, and she never once flinched. 18 months later, Margaret married Thomas Callahan in the same church where I used to pray he'd come home to marry me. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it for 70 years. My own sister married the man who broke my heart, and the whole family treated it like some kind of storybook ending. Well, at least it stayed in the family, my mother used to say, like that was supposed to comfort me, like I was supposed to be grateful my heartbreak worked out so conveniently for somebody else. I smiled through that wedding. I stood up as a bridesmaid. I hugged my sister and told her I was happy for her, and some small, broken part of me even believed it, because what other story was there for me to believe? He left me for someone else, and that someone else happened to be my sister, and that was just rotten luck, wasn't it? I remember standing at the altar rail in a dress the color of pale gold, holding a bouquet of white carnations, watching Tommy Callahan turn around to see his bride walk down the aisle. I remember he glanced at me first for just a half a second before he found Margaret. I told myself for 70 years that half second was an apology. I know now it was something closer to confusion, a man looking for the woman he thought had left him, finding her standing there in a bridesmaid's dress instead, smiling like her heart was in pieces. At the reception, Margaret found me by the punch bowl and hugged me tight and whispered in my ear, "Thank you for being so gracious about this, Ellie. It means everything to me." I told her, and I meant it at the time, that family always comes first. I actually believed that sentence was a kindness I was giving her. I had no idea I was congratulating the architect of my own ruin. That was the story I told myself for 70 years. 70 years, and it was never true, not one word of it. Here's what I didn't know until 3 months ago, sitting in my granddaughter's living room with that dead letter in my lap. Claire had made tea, I remember that detail so clearly, because I had a cup in my hand when I opened that envelope, and by the time I finished the first paragraph, my hand was shaking so badly the tea had spilled all down the front of my cardigan, and I hadn't even noticed. Claire took the cup from me first. Then, when she saw my face, she took the letter, too, and she read it out loud, slow, because I couldn't get through it myself. The letter began, "My dearest Ellie, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I have to try one more time to tell you the truth before I ship home, because I cannot marry anyone else, not even to please my commanding officer's daughter he keeps trying to introduce me to, until you know that every word I've written you these last months I meant with my whole heart. And I don't understand why your letters have gone so cold, unless someone has convinced you I'm not worth waiting for." Claire had to stop reading twice, once because her own voice broke, once because mine did. The letter went on for 2 more pages, describing things I hadn't thought about in 70 years. The little river bend where we used to sit on the tailgate, a song that had played on the radio the last night we danced in my parents' kitchen. A promise he said he intended to keep the moment his boots touched American soil again. Reading it felt like being handed a version of my own life I'd been told my entire adulthood never existed. At the very end, in handwriting that had gotten shakier, like it had been written in a hurry, possibly on a train or a dock somewhere waiting to ship home, he'd written one final line: "If you get this and you still love me, come find me. If you don't, I'll understand, but I needed you to know the truth before I let anyone else believe otherwise." He never got the chance to send a second copy. He never knew this one didn't reach me either, not for 70 years. Margaret never once mailed my letters to Tommy, not after the first few weeks. She kept walking to the post office every day, like she promised, and every day she'd take my letter and instead of mailing it, she'd tuck it into a shoebox in the back of her closet. Then she'd sit down and write Tommy a letter herself, in a hand close enough to mine that a homesick soldier, reading it fast, half a world away, would never catch the difference, except her letters got colder every week, distant, uninterested. She was slowly, deliberately killing my relationship, one forged page at a time. Reading her diary later, Claire and I could actually reconstruct how she did it, almost day by day. She'd walk to the collection box on her way to the telephone exchange, just like she promised, and she'd drop her own mail in plain sight of anyone watching, but mine she'd slide into her coat pocket instead, and later that night, alone in her room, she'd open it, read every private word I'd poured out for the man I loved, and decide, letter by letter, what Tommy was and wasn't allowed to know about how I felt. One diary entry from that period described it almost proudly. "Read Ellie's letter tonight. She really does love him. It's almost a shame." Almost a shame. Not enough of a shame to stop. And when Tommy, confused, hurt, wondering why the girl he loved had gone cold on him, wrote back trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, Margaret intercepted those letters too. She never let a single one reach me. Not one. I can't believe this. I know that's what you're thinking right now because it's exactly what I thought, sitting there at 94 years old, finding out the truth. I can't believe this. I said it out loud over and over, and my granddaughter Claire just held my hand and let me say it as many times as I needed to. That final letter, the one that said he'd met a nurse and didn't want to string me along, Margaret wrote every word of it herself. There was no nurse. There never was a nurse. Tommy Callahan never once fell out of love with me. What actually happened was this. Margaret forged a letter in my handwriting. My handwriting, learned from years of writing next to me at that same kitchen table, telling Tommy that I'd met somebody new at the hardware store, that I didn't want him to feel obligated to me anymore, that he should feel free to move on. The letter I received 70 years too late, the one that finally reached my hands, was Tommy's response to that forged letter, written the same week he shipped back stateside, and in it he told me the truth he never got the chance to tell me in person, because by the time he was back on American soil, Margaret had already gotten to him first, waiting at the train station with a story about how I'd fallen for someone else and moved to Cleveland to be with him, how I didn't want to be found. He believed her. Grieving, confused, betrayed by a version of me that never existed, he let Margaret comfort him, and Margaret, patient, calculating Margaret, was right there for 2 more years, whittling away at his broken heart until he finally agreed to marry her instead. Claire and I pieced together from the diary and from a few things Patricia remembered from that period, roughly what happened at that train station the day Tommy came home. Margaret showed up alone in her Sunday best and told him I'd asked her to pass along the news herself because I didn't have the nerve to write it in a letter, that I'd met someone in Cleveland, a man from a good family, and that I was ashamed to face him after leading him on for so long. Tommy, exhausted, homesick, half his unit lost overseas, had no reason in the world to doubt his own fiancée's own sister. Why would he? She'd been the one faithfully carrying our love back and forth for 2 years, or so he believed. I try some nights not to imagine that scene too clearly. A tired young soldier stepping off a train expecting to marry the woman he loved, met instead by her sister with a story engineered to break exactly what needed breaking. I wasn't even there. I didn't even know there was anything to grieve that day. I was home, going about an ordinary afternoon, utterly unaware that the last real chance at the life I wanted had just been quietly, deliberately taken from me on a train platform 2 towns over. I can't believe this. There it is again. I still say it some mornings, even now, even after everything I did about it, because the woman who was supposed to be my built-in best friend for life spent 2 years constructing a lie so complete that it didn't just cost me a fiancé, it cost me 60 years of the life I was supposed to have. Patricia, years later, at that birthday party, would tell me she remembered Margaret being the one who kept checking in on Tommy those 2 years, bringing him supper when Ruth was busy, inviting him to family gatherings even after I stopped attending them, slowly making herself indispensable to a grieving man who had no idea the person filling the hole in his life was the same person who'd carved it there. It wasn't love. not the kind Margaret liked to pretend at that wedding reception. It was patience, aimed at a target, sustained for 2 full years. 2 years after Margaret's wedding, I met David Whitfield at a church social I almost didn't go to. My mother practically had to push me out the door. I'd turned into something of a homebody by then, the kind of woman who found reasons to stay in on Friday nights. David was patient with me in a way I didn't fully appreciate until much later in life. He never once made me feel rushed. He courted me slow, the way you'd coax a spooked animal back toward you. And after 2 years of that patience, I said yes when he asked me to marry him, mostly because I trusted him, and trust, by that point in my life, felt like the safest kind of love I could still access. I want to be fair to David, wherever he is now. He was a good man. He worked hard. He never raised his voice at me or the kids in 41 years of marriage, and he loved me as completely as a person can love someone who's already given the best part of her heart away to somebody else years before they ever met. I think, somewhere in his quiet way, David always knew there was a locked room in me he wasn't allowed into. He never pushed the door. I loved him for that, among other things. I married a good man eventually, David. I loved him in my own way, and I don't regret the 4 children we raised together. But there is a difference between a good marriage and the marriage you were supposed to have, and some part of me always knew there was a hole in my life shaped exactly like Thomas Callahan. I just never knew until 3 months ago that the hole was carved there on purpose, by my own sister. I sat in Claire's living room for what felt like hours, running the whole timeline of my own life backwards. Every holiday I'd spent at Margaret's table, every time she'd asked so sweetly if I was doing all right, if I'd ever really gotten over that Callahan business. I thought about the year Tommy passed away and Margaret called me, crying, and I comforted her on the phone for 45 minutes, telling her what a wonderful marriage she'd had. I comforted her for the marriage she stole. I remember the smell of that tea going cold on Claire's coffee table, the sound of her clock ticking in the next room, the particular gray light coming through her curtains that afternoon. Some moments burn themselves into you so completely that even the smallest, most unimportant details stay with you forever. I could draw you a picture of that living room today, 94 years old, and get every detail right, because that was the exact hour my entire life quietly rearranged itself into a story that finally made sense. Claire finally asked me, very gently, "Grandma, are you okay?" And I remember telling her the truest thing I could find in that moment. I don't know yet. I think I need a few days before I know what I'm feeling. She didn't push me. She just sat with me and made more tea and let the quiet do what quiet does. It took 3 days before the numbness cracked open into something with an edge to it. 3 days before I stopped just feeling sad and started feeling something colder, sharper, more useful. I kept asking Claire the same question over and over those first few days, the same question I imagine anyone would ask. Why, Claire? Why would she do this to me? Claire, bless her, didn't try to answer it for me. She just let me ask it as many times as I needed, until one night, on my own, lying awake in her guest room, I think I finally understood it myself. Margaret spent her whole childhood 2 years ahead of me, and always, somehow, 1 step behind in the ways that mattered to her. I was the daughter who charmed people without trying. She was the daughter who had to work for every bit of warmth she got. I don't say that to excuse one single thing she did. I say it because I think,
Somewhere in her 23-year-old heart, she convinced herself that taking Tommy away from me wasn't stealing, it was finally, for once in her whole life, getting the thing she'd watched me get first, without even trying. That doesn't make it forgivable, but it made it finally make a terrible kind of sense. I want to be honest about something else, too, something I didn't expect to feel. Underneath the rage, and there was plenty of rage, believe me, there was also grief for a sister I thought I'd had my whole life, who it turns out I never really had at all. I lost Tommy twice, once in 1952, and once again 3 months ago, learning the whole thing had been a lie. But I also lost Margaret that day, the version of her I'd carried in my heart for 70 years. That loss surprised me more than anything else. But what happened next, I never saw coming either, because finding out the truth was only the beginning. I'm going to tell you something about grief that nobody tells you when you're young. Grief doesn't always look like crying. Sometimes, at 94 years old, grief looks like sitting very, very still in your granddaughter's kitchen for 3 days, barely speaking, doing math in your head. 60 years, 70 years, how many Christmases, how many nights I cried myself to sleep wondering what I'd done wrong to make a man stop loving me when he never stopped at all. My granddaughter, Claire, God bless that girl, is the one who found the letter in the first place. She'd read an article about the Postal Service finally clearing out a decades-old backlog of undeliverable and dead mail from a base closure file, cross-referencing addresses against public records, reuniting old letters with families. She'd submitted my maiden name almost as a lark, thinking maybe there'd be an old birthday card from a forgotten cousin. She was the one sitting next to me when I opened it. She was the one who saw my face change. And she was the one 3 days later who finally asked me the question that started everything. "Grandma," she said, "what do you want to do about this?" I didn't answer her right away. I remember getting up, walking to the window, looking out at Claire's little garden for a long time before I finally said, "I want her to know that I know, and I want everyone else to know it too." Claire didn't flinch. She just nodded, like she'd been waiting for me to say exactly that. I want to be very clear with you about something, because I know some of you watching are already halfway to imagining me doing something dramatic, something that would land me on the evening news. That was never what I wanted. I am 94 years old. I did not want to burn anything down. I wanted the truth, that's all. I wanted 70 years of a lie corrected, and I wanted it corrected in a way nobody could ever again pretend didn't happen. Margaret was still alive, 96 years old, living in an assisted care facility 40 minutes from my house, sharp enough most days to know exactly what was going on around her. Tommy had passed away 11 years earlier. Margaret had inherited everything, his pension, his modest life insurance, and a piece of property his family had owned for 3 generations, land that Tommy, in his own handwriting, in that very letter, had said he wanted to leave to me one day, "So you'll always have a piece of home that's really yours." That line, sitting in that letter, was the first thread I pulled, because it wasn't just heartbreak anymore. It was a paper trail. I called my daughter, who's a paralegal, and asked her, very carefully, very calmly, what it would take to prove that a piece of property had been promised to someone under false pretenses, where the person who orchestrated the deception was still alive, and the original intent was recorded, in writing, by the deceased. She told me 2 things. First, that it wouldn't be simple, but it also wasn't impossible. There's a legal concept called a constructive trust, where a court can recognize that property should belong to someone even without a formal will naming them, if there's clear evidence the deceased intended it, and someone else's fraud is what prevented that intent from being honored.
Second, she told me I needed a real estate and probate attorney, not just her professional opinion, and she found me one within the week. I sat across from that attorney, a calm, no-nonsense woman named Frances Delgado, and laid out 70 years of my life in about 20 minutes. She listened without interrupting once. When she finished, she folded her hands and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I've handled a lot of estate disputes in my career. I don't think I've ever heard one with this much heartbreak sitting on top of it. But heartbreak isn't evidence. Let's talk about what is." She walked me through exactly what we'd need: the letters themselves verified, the timeline airtight, and ideally some acknowledgement, however small, from Margaret herself or from someone close to her that could corroborate the story. Juries and judges don't convict people of breaking hearts, she told me, but they can absolutely recognize fraud if you can prove it. But I want to be honest with you. The property was never really the point for me. I have plenty. I've lived a comfortable life. The point, the thing that kept me up at night, was making sure that before I died, every single person in this family who loved and admired Margaret for getting her happy ending knew exactly how she got it. My youngest son, Mark, called me the week after I first told the family what I'd found, and he was gentle about it but firm. "Mom, she's 96. What good does it do to blow up her whole family now?" I understood where he was coming from. He'd grown up loving his Aunt Margaret. He didn't have 70 years of stolen letters sitting in his chest the way I did. I told him the same thing I'm telling you now. This was never about punishing an old woman for the sake of punishment. It was about making sure the truth existed somewhere besides my own private grief, before I wasn't around anymore to say it out loud myself. Mark came around, eventually, once he read the letters himself. It's hard to argue with a dead man's own handwriting. My eldest daughter, Susan, reacted differently. She wanted to move faster than I did, actually, and had to be talked down more than once from marching straight over to the care facility herself. "Mom, I've spent my whole life thinking you were somehow the one who did something wrong back then," she told me, crying on the phone. "I need her to know what she did to you." I told Susan the same thing I'd tell any of you watching who feel that same pull toward speed. The truth lands harder when it's delivered calm and certain than when it's delivered in anger. Anger fades. Evidence doesn't. So here was the plan Claire and I built together over the course of about 6 weeks. Step 1, verify everything. Claire tracked down a handwriting expert, the same kind used in estate disputes, who confirmed, comparing the forged letters, which Margaret, in a moment of either arrogance or carelessness, had never destroyed, and which surfaced in a box of Tommy's old effects that his and Margaret's son, Richard, still had in storage, against genuine samples of my handwriting from the same era, that the forgeries were close but not perfect. Under expert analysis, they fell apart completely. I sat in on that appointment myself in a small office that smelled like old paper and watched the expert, a patient man named Mr. Osei, who'd spent 30 years testifying in will disputes, lay the letters side by side under a bright lamp with a magnifying loupe. He pointed out things I never would have noticed on my own, the way my genuine G always looped back on itself a certain way, and the forger's G almost got it right, but not quite, every single time in exactly the same wrong way, which told him it wasn't a natural variation, but a learned, practiced copy. "Someone studied your handwriting carefully," he told me. "This isn't a rushed forgery. This is someone who had years to get it right." Years. That word landed harder than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. Margaret hadn't done this in a moment of weakness. She'd practiced. Step 2, build the timeline. We laid out every letter, mine that never arrived, Tommy's that never reached me, the forged ones Margaret sent in my name, in chronological order, cross-referenced against postmarks, against dates in Margaret's own old diaries, which her son Richard, having no idea what he was handing over, lent to Claire for a family history project she pretended to be doing. One of the first calls I made once I decided to move forward was to Dorothy, my old friend from the diner, the one who'd braided my hair and asked odd questions about Margaret all those decades ago. She's 93 now, living with her daughter 2 states over, sharp as ever. When I told her what I'd found, she was quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Ellie, I've wondered about that girl for 70 years. I always felt guilty I never said more." She agreed without hesitation to write down everything she remembered from that time, the odd questions Margaret used to ask her at the exchange, the strange comment about Margaret asking after Tommy long after the nurse letter arrived, and sign it, notarized, as a supporting statement. Getting Dorothy's account mattered to me more than almost anything else in this whole ordeal, and not just for the legal weight of it, though Frances told me it helped considerably. It mattered because for 70 years I thought I'd been alone in sensing something was wrong and ignoring it. Finding out someone else had seen it too and simply hadn't had the words for it either made me feel less like a fool for having trusted my sister so completely. Getting those diaries in the first place took some careful maneuvering on Claire's part. She visited Richard on a pretense, a genuine one in a way, since she really is putting together a family history project, just not the innocent kind Richard imagined. She told him she wanted to document the family's wartime years for the grandchildren, and Richard, delighted that anyone in the younger generation cared about family history at all, dug 3 old diaries out of his mother's storage boxes without a second thought and handed them right over. "Careful with these," he told Claire, smiling. "Mom would kill me if she knew I let these out of the house." Claire told me afterward her stomach dropped a little at that comment, but she smiled back and thanked him anyway. Reading Margaret's diary entries from that period was its own particular kind of gut punch. She wrote about Tommy constantly in the early entries in a hopeful, longing way that made it obvious just how deep her feelings ran, even while I was completely in the dark. Then, around the time his letters to me started thinning out, her entries shifted to something colder and more strategic. One entry, dated just a few weeks before that final nurse letter arrived, simply read, "Sent another one today. He's coming around. Ellie suspects nothing." I read that line maybe a dozen times before it fully sank in. Claire had to take the diary out of my hands the same way she'd taken that first letter, because I was gripping it so hard my knuckles had gone white. Claire also tracked down old post office employment records through a retired postal historian she found through a genealogy forum, a kind man named Walter, who volunteered his time helping families piece together exactly this kind of story. He confirmed that Margaret's daily walking route to the telephone exchange did in fact pass directly by the collection box, meaning she'd had the opportunity every single day for the better part of 2 years to either mail my letters or quietly slip them into her coat pocket instead. Opportunity alone isn't proof, but stacked next to everything else, it closed the last gap in the story. Step 3, and this was the hardest one, decide what justice actually looked like for a 96-year-old woman in a care facility who could not be unmarried, uninherit, or have 60 years handed back to her. I thought about that question longer than almost anything else in my life, and here's what I landed on. I didn't want Margaret arrested. I didn't want her thrown out of her care facility. I am not a cruel woman, and 2 wrongs have never once in the history of the world made a right. What I wanted was for the truth to exist, permanently, undeniably, in the one place Margaret had spent her entire life protecting, her reputation with her own children and grandchildren, and her legal claim to property that was never rightfully hers to keep. I called Frances, the attorney, and told her exactly that. She said something I've thought about many times since. "Mrs. Whitfield, some clients want money, some want an apology. It sounds like what you actually want is for the record to reflect reality. That's a legitimate thing to want, and it's one of the few human decency and law actually agree on." That conversation settled something in me. I wasn't chasing revenge for its own sake. I was chasing an accurate accounting of my own life, and I decided right then I wasn't going to feel guilty about wanting that. Richard, Margaret and Tommy's son, my own nephew, and biologically, I'll remind you, half-cousin to my own children in the strange, braided way families like ours end up, had always been told his mother and father had a great romance, cut short only by my moving on. He adored his mother. He'd built a piece of his own identity around that story. Claire's plan and mine was simple in its bones, even if it took weeks to arrange. Margaret's 96th birthday party was coming up in 6 weeks, a family gathering Richard had been planning for months, with nearly 30 relatives attending, including several of Tommy's surviving cousins who'd known him since childhood and always wondered, quietly, why he'd seemed a little sadder in his later years than a man who married for love should be.
We chose that party deliberately and not casually. A private conversation with Margaret alone would have let her control the story the way she'd controlled every story about herself for 70 years. Deny it, soften it, turn it into something explainable, the same way she'd explained away Frank Doyle, explained away her cold letters, explained away a lifetime of small, careful manipulations. A public setting, in front of the people who loved her most, took that control away from her for the first time in her life. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply refusing to let her write this chapter too. We would bring the letters, all of them, and I would tell the truth, in my own voice, at that party, in front of everyone who had spent 70 years believing a story that was never real. There was a near miss, though, that almost stopped the whole plan before it started. 3 weeks before the party, Richard called Claire out of the blue, sounding uneasy, saying his mother had been acting strange, asking pointed questions about old letters and whether anyone had been going through storage boxes. Somehow, we still don't know exactly how, maybe a slip from a well-meaning relative, maybe just an old woman's instinct, Margaret suspected something was coming. Claire and I sat in my kitchen that night, genuinely afraid the whole plan might unravel before we ever got the chance to speak our truth out loud. But we didn't back down. We didn't rush either. We simply proceeded exactly as planned, holding our evidence close, and trusted that the truth, once spoken, wouldn't need protecting anymore. 2 days after that phone call, Margaret herself called me directly, something she rarely did anymore. Our calls had thinned out over the years to birthdays and holidays. Her voice was sweet as syrup, the same voice I remembered from every kitchen table conversation of my whole childhood. "Ellie, I heard Claire's been asking Richard about old family things. Is everything all right? You know you can always just ask me directly. We're sisters." My hands were shaking so badly holding that phone, I almost told her everything right then, out of some old instinct to be honest with my sister the way I'd always been. But I caught myself. I told her Claire was just working on a family tree project for one of her kids' school assignments, and that seemed to satisfy her. I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long time afterward, feeling, for the first time in 70 years, like I finally understood exactly how good my sister was at making a lie sound like love. The attorney filed a quiet preliminary legal notice regarding the property 1 week before the party, not a lawsuit yet, just a formal assertion of claim on record, timed deliberately. I spent 3 full evenings writing and rewriting what I was going to say at that party, sitting at Claire's kitchen table with a legal pad, crossing out lines that sounded too angry, then crossing out other lines that sounded too soft. Claire read every draft out loud to me so I could hear how it landed. "You don't need to perform anger, Grandma. You just need to tell them what happened. The facts will do the rest." That single piece of advice ended up being the truest thing anyone told me through this whole process. I practiced reading Tommy's letter out loud more times than I could count,
in the mirror, in the car, standing at my own kitchen sink at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I needed my voice to hold steady when it mattered. I owed him that much, after 70 years of silence he never chose. And I picked out, with more care than I'd picked out my own wedding dress 70 years earlier, exactly what I was going to say. But what happened at that party, none of us, not even Claire, saw coming. The party was held at Richard's house, in a backyard strung with lights, 30-some relatives in lawn chairs, a cake with 96 candles that took 2 of Richard's grandkids to light. Margaret sat in the place of honor, sharp-eyed, dressed in lavender, looking every bit the beloved matriarch she'd spent 70 years building herself into. I sat near the back, with Claire beside me, a manila folder in my lap that I hadn't let out of my sight in 6 weeks. I remember Claire leaning over and whispering, "You don't have to do this tonight, Grandma. We can wait." And I remember squeezing her hand and telling her, "I've waited 70 years, sweetheart. Tonight's the night." My heart was pounding so hard I thought the people 2 chairs down could probably hear it. The string lights swayed a little in the evening breeze. Somewhere near the grill, Richard's wife was laughing with one of the cousins about a burnt batch of corn. Children ran between the folding tables with sparklers Richard had bought for the occasion, and for one strange, suspended moment, I let myself just watch it all. This whole warm, ordinary family evening, built, every bit of it, on a foundation I was about to pull out from underneath everyone in that yard. Part of me wanted to just let them have the evening, but I thought of Tommy's handwriting, of 60 years of Christmases spent quietly grieving a man who never stopped loving me, and I knew if I didn't say something that night, I might never find the courage again. Richard gave a toast. He talked about his parents' great love story, how his father used to tell him that finding the right person sometimes means losing the wrong one first. He raised his glass and said, "Mom always told us that real love finds a way, even when life gets complicated. Looking at you and Dad's whole life together, I believe her." I watched several relatives nod along, dabbing their eyes, completely unaware they were crying over a lie. I remember looking over at Margaret during that toast. She had her hand pressed to her chest, playing the part of the moved, humble matriarch so perfectly that even I, sitting there with 70 years of proof in a folder on my lap, almost second-guessed myself for one terrible second. That's how good she was. That's how good she'd always been. When the toast ended and people began to clap, I stood up. My legs shook a little. 94 years old does that to a person, but my voice, when it came out, didn't shake at all. "Before we cut the cake," I said, "I'd like to say a few words too, about that same love story." Margaret's face changed before I'd even finished the sentence. That was the moment I knew, with total certainty, that she remembered exactly what she'd done. A woman who'd truly forgotten, or truly believed her own story, wouldn't have gone that pale that fast. I told them everything. I told them about the letters I wrote every week for a soldier who never received them. I told them about the shoebox in a closet that carried away my entire future. I read, out loud, 3 lines from Tommy's real final letter, the one that arrived 70 years late, where he wrote that he never stopped loving me, that he only ever married Margaret because he believed, with his whole broken heart, that I didn't want him anymore. I want you to imagine 30 relatives at a 96th birthday party sitting in dead silence in a backyard full of string lights while a 94-year-old woman reads a dead man's handwriting out loud. I also brought the forged letters, the ones written in a hand meant to look like mine, and I held them up next to a genuine letter I'd written to a girlfriend that same year, one Dorothy had kept all this time and given to me for exactly this purpose.
"Look closely," I told the yard full of relatives. "Look at the way the letters lean. My sister spent months learning to write like me so a lonely soldier a world away would never know the difference." Nobody said a word. I could hear the citronella candles crackling on the tables. I could hear somebody's grandchild, too young to understand what was happening, asking their mother in a whisper why everyone got so quiet. Richard was the one who broke first. He stood up, folder in my hand forgotten, and asked, voice cracking, "Mum, is this true?" And Margaret, 96 years old, sharp as ever, out of options for 70 years, didn't deny it. She just sat there, lavender dress, birthday candles melting into cake behind her, and said very quietly, "I loved him first." That was it. That was her entire defense. After 70 years, I loved him first, as though loving someone first gives you the right to steal every letter meant for somebody else, to forge a living woman's handwriting, to let your own sister believe she was unlovable for 6 decades so you could have the man you wanted. My own daughter, sitting a few chairs down from me, whispered, "Oh my God," so loud half the yard heard it. An older cousin I hadn't seen in years, a man named Edward who'd always sided with Margaret in every old family disagreement, just sat there shaking his head slowly over and over, muttering, 70 years, 70 years, Maggie." I know some of you are screaming at your screen right now. I was screaming inside my own chest. Here's the part I need you to feel, because I felt every bit of it. Richard didn't defend his mother. His own children, Margaret's grandchildren, sat there with their mouths open, looking at the woman they'd celebrated their entire lives as some kind of storybook heroine, finally seeing her clearly for the first time. One of Tommy's elderly cousins, a woman named Patricia, who'd known him since childhood, stood up and said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "I always wondered why Tommy looked so sad in his wedding photos. Now I know." Patricia had grown up 2 farms over from the Callahans and had known Tommy since they were both in diapers. She told me later, privately, that she'd always assumed his quiet, faraway moods over the years were just his way. Some men are just built melancholy, she said her own mother used to claim. Hearing the truth that night rearranged 60 years of assumptions about a man she'd loved like a brother. Margaret's own grandchildren, 3 of them, all grown, all sitting together near the dessert table, went completely silent. One of them, a young woman named Beth, who I'd always adored at family gatherings, finally said quietly, to no one in particular, this is why she never let us read Grandpa's old letters. She always said they were too personal. It wasn't an accusation, it was just a granddaughter watching her whole understanding of her family rearrange itself in real time. Yes, that's exactly the moment. If you're the type to cheer at your screen during these stories, that was mine. Patricia saying that out loud in front of everyone, 70 years of quiet grief finally being seen by somebody besides me. The property claim went forward 2 weeks later. Francis filed the full petition attaching the letter itself, the handwriting expert's report, and sworn statements from both Claire and Walter, the postal historian, documenting the timeline we'd built. Richard, to his enormous credit, chose not to fight the claim on his mother's behalf once he'd read the evidence himself. He told Francis directly that he wanted no part of defending something built on a lie, even one that gave him his own life. Margaret, facing the mounting evidence, and I suspect facing far more pressure from her own mortified family than any attorney, chose not to contest it either. The land Tommy wanted
to have, written in his own hand, came to me within 4 months, not because I needed it, but because it was the one piece of this whole story that could actually, legally, undeniably be set right. I drove out to see that land the week the paperwork finalized. 3 acres of quiet Ohio farmland with an old oak tree near the property line that Tommy, in one of his very first letters, had described teaching himself to whittle under as a boy. I stood under that same tree for a long time, an old woman in her 90s, finally standing on the one piece of ground a good man had wanted her to have all along. I brought Claire with me that day. We didn't say much. She just held my arm as we walked the property line, and at one point she said, quietly, "He really did love you, Grandma, all this time." I told her yes, he did, and for the first time in 3 months, saying it out loud didn't hurt. It just felt true, plain and simple, the way it should have felt all along, 70 years ago, before anyone ever decided to take that truth away from me. Margaret is still alive as I record this. She lives in the same care facility. Richard visits her less than he used to, and when he does, Claire tells me the conversations are different now, quieter, careful, the easy warmth gone out of them. I didn't do that to punish her, though I won't pretend there isn't some part of me at peace knowing it happened. I did it because the truth deserved to exist in the open air, after 70 years locked in a shoebox. Richard called me himself 3 days after the party, and we talked for almost 2 hours. He apologized to me over and over for a lifetime of thinking I was the woman who'd broken his father's heart and moved on without a backward glance. "I spent my whole life a little cold toward you at family things, Aunt Ellie, and I never even had a real reason for it. I'm so sorry." I told him none of it was his fault. He was just a boy who believed the story his mother told him, the same way I once believed it too. He also told me that night I hadn't known, that his father, in his final years, used to sit out on the back porch some evenings, quiet, staring at nothing in particular, and when Richard asked him once what he was thinking about, Tommy just said, "Old times, son, just old times." Richard said he always assumed his father meant the war. Now he knows better. I did go see Margaret once, on my own, about 2 months after that party. Claire didn't come with me, and I didn't tell anyone I was going. I sat with her in the small common room of her facility, just the 2 of us, and I asked her the only question I still needed answered. "Did you ever love me at all, Maggie, or was I always just something in your way?" She was quiet for a long time before she answered. Then she said, "I loved you the way you love a sister you're jealous of your whole life. I'm not proud of what I did. I'm 96 years old, and I still don't know how to be sorry enough to make it matter." I didn't forgive her that day. I'm not sure I ever fully will. But I told her I was glad she finally said something honest, and I meant that. Sometimes the only justice left available to you is simply hearing somebody stop lying.
Here's the twist, though, the one I really didn't see coming, even after everything. About a month after the party, I got a letter, a real one, current postmark and everything, from Patricia, Tommy's cousin. Tucked inside it was a photograph I'd never seen. Tommy, in his army uniform, the week before he shipped home, holding a photo of me in one hand, the one I'd sent him in an earlier uninterrupted letter, smiling at it like it was the only good thing in the world. Patricia had kept it in an old shoebox of her own for 70 years, not knowing it mattered to anyone, until she heard my story at that party and remembered she had it. She wrote in her letter that Tommy had given her the photograph himself, decades ago, at a family gathering not long after his wedding to Margaret, saying only, "Keep this safe for me, would you, Pat? I don't have anywhere else I trust to put it." She never fully understood why he'd asked her, of all people, until that birthday party finally explained it. He'd kept a piece of the truth alive, too, quietly, the same way I had, for as long as he lived. I sat with that photograph for a long time. It didn't give me back 60 years, nothing could do that, but it gave me proof in his own face of something I'd spent 70 years being told wasn't true, that I was loved, completely, by a good man, right up until somebody I trusted stole that love out of both of our hands. Claire and I spent the next several weeks putting together a small written record of the whole story, copies of the real letters, the forged ones side by side for comparison, the diary excerpts, all of it bound together in a plain folder, and made sure a copy went to every single one of my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and to Margaret's grandchildren too. I didn't do that to humiliate anyone further. I did it so that 70 years from now, long after I'm gone, nobody in this family will ever again have the chance to quietly rewrite what actually happened, the way it got rewritten for 60 decades right under my nose. I'm 94 years old, and if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the truth doesn't have an expiration date. It can sit in a shoebox, in a dead letter bin, in a lie repeated so many times a whole family believes it, and 70 years later, it can still walk back through the door and demand to be heard. I didn't get my 60 years back with Tommy Callahan. Nobody could give me that. But I got something I didn't know I still needed at 94 years old. I got to stop believing I was unlovable. I got to watch a family finally see clearly. And I got to make sure that when I'm gone, nobody tells my grandchildren a story that isn't true. I framed that photograph Patricia sent me, Tommy in his uniform, holding my picture like it was the only good thing in the world, and I keep it on my nightstand now, right next to that little silver locket I've had since I was 21. Some nights I still cry looking at it, but it's a different kind of crying than I did for 70 years. It's the kind that comes from finally being believed, even if the only person left who needed to believe me was myself. There are mornings now when I wake up, look at that photograph and that locket sitting side by side, and just feel a kind of quiet gratitude I never expected to feel about any of this. Not gratitude that it happened. I'll never be grateful for 70 stolen years. But gratitude that the truth found its way home eventually, even this late, even after everyone who could have simply told me the truth outright chose silence instead. Late is not the same as never. I had to live to 94 to fully understand the difference, but I understand it now, all the way through. I think about Margaret sometimes, out there in that care facility, and I feel something more complicated than hatred. I feel sad for the woman who spent her whole life so hungry for something that was never really mine to give her in the first place. I've made my peace, as much peace as a person can make with something like this. I stopped waiting for her to be sorry enough. I decided the truth itself was going to have to be enough for me, and most days now it is. Some of my grandchildren have asked me if I regret waiting so long to find out, if I wish that letter had reached me 70 years ago the way it was supposed to. I've thought about that question more than any other since this all started, and honestly, I don't know. Maybe if it had arrived on time, I'd have found Tommy, married him instead, had an entirely different set of children, an entirely different life. Or maybe Margaret would have found some other way to keep us apart. I try not to spend too much of whatever time I have left grieving a life I never got to live. I'd rather spend it grateful for the one I did, messy and stolen from as parts of it turned out to be. If you'd been in my shoes, if you found out at any age that someone you trusted had quietly stolen the biggest love of your life, I want to know what you would have done. Would you have confronted them privately? Would you have done exactly what I did? Or would you have let it go? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. I've read that some of you, watching stories like mine, have your own version of a Margaret somewhere in your family, a sibling, a friend, someone who took something you never got the chance to fight for at the time. If that's you, I hope some part of this story gave you permission to stop assuming it was always just bad luck. Sometimes it's bad luck, and sometimes, like it was for me, it's somebody else's quiet, patient hand on the scale the whole time. And if this story moved you even half as much as it moved me to live it, do me a favor and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, true stories about the quiet betrayals people carry for years and the moments when the truth finally gets its say. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.